Who is this guy? The words cracked through the elegant rooftop restaurant before anyone had time to react, sharp enough to silence the quiet hum of conversation and the gentle clink of crystal glasses. Every head turned toward the tall man standing near the entrance, his tailored charcoal suit untouched by the cool Manhattan evening breeze, his blue eyes fixed on one table and one table only. Caleb Whitmore never raised his voice in public. As the billionaire founder of Whitmore Holdings, he had built a reputation for impossible discipline, calm decisions, and a face that rarely betrayed emotion. But tonight, every carefully constructed wall around him seemed to disappear the moment he saw Grace Bennett smiling across the table from another man. Ryan Cole looked up in confusion, halfway through reaching for the dessert menu, while Grace froze with her hand wrapped around a glass of sparkling water. She recognized Caleb instantly, and for one impossible second it felt as though the entire city had vanished beneath the glowing skyline. 3 weeks earlier, she would have laughed if someone had told her this quiet, thoughtful man would storm into one of New York's most exclusive restaurants looking like he had just watched his future slip away. Back then, Caleb had been nothing more than a customer who wandered into the little diner where Grace worked double shifts on the west side of Manhattan. The diner smelled of fresh coffee, grilled onions, and homemade pie, the kind of place where people remembered your name but rarely remembered your dreams. Grace remembered both. She remembered every regular, every order, every smile she could earn with a fresh cup of coffee and genuine kindness. She had to. Tips paid the rent on her tiny studio apartment, and whatever remained helped cover the growing stack of medical bills for her mother's physical therapy. Dreams came last. They always did. On the afternoon they first met, rain had poured across the city without warning. Caleb entered wearing a simple navy jacket soaked through at the shoulders, his hair damp from the walk, looking more like an exhausted office worker than one of America's youngest billionaires. No security, no luxury car waiting outside, no expensive watch displayed for attention, just another tired man searching for somewhere warm. Grace greeted him with the same bright smile she offered everyone. "Long day?" she had asked while placing a steaming mug of coffee in front of him before he even requested it. Caleb looked surprised. "Is it that obvious?" She laughed softly, only to someone who's seen that face about 1,000 times. He smiled for what felt like the first time in days. She had no idea that newspapers called him the king of billion-dollar acquisitions. She did not know business channels analyzed every sentence he spoke. To her, he was simply another customer carrying invisible weight. While he waited for his sandwich, Grace quietly flipped over an old receipt and absent-mindedly sketched his profile with the tiny pencil she always carried inside her apron. Drawing had become her escape ever since she was a little girl, and even now her worn sketchbook traveled everywhere with her, filled with storefront ideas, wedding invitation designs, and dreams she never spoke aloud. When she noticed Caleb watching, embarrassment colored her cheeks. "Sorry," she admitted with a nervous laugh. "You looked like someone with an interesting story." Caleb accepted the little sketch as though it were worth far more than the bill it had been drawn on. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him without seeing headlines, stock prices, or endless zeros. She had simply seen a tired man who needed a warm meal and a reason to smile. Neither of them realized that one ordinary afternoon, one forgotten sketch, and one unexpected act of kindness had already begun changing both of their lives forever, making the question echoing across the rooftop tonight far more dangerous than anyone at that table could possibly imagine. Grace spent the next several days wondering why the quiet customer in the navy jacket kept returning to the diner. Every Tuesday and Thursday, almost at the exact same time, he chose the booth beside the front window instead of the comfortable corner seats everyone else preferred. He always ordered the same lunch, always thanked every employee by name, and always left before the afternoon rush filled the room with construction workers, delivery drivers, and office employees escaping expensive downtown cafes. To Grace, Caleb seemed like someone who carried responsibility everywhere he went, yet never spoke about it. Whenever she asked what he did for a living, he simply smiled and answered, "I work in investments." It sounded ordinary enough, and she never questioned him further. She had learned long ago that people revealed their real stories only when they felt safe enough to do so. Instead, their conversations drifted toward books, neighborhoods, favorite parks, and impossible dreams. One rainy afternoon, Caleb noticed Grace carefully erasing a sketch inside her worn notebook while waiting for another table to finish eating. "Can I see it?" he asked. She hesitated for a second before handing it across the table. Inside were dozens of hand-drawn wedding invitations, elegant storefront designs, handwritten logos, and cozy little cafes decorated with flowers. "These are incredible," Caleb said honestly. Grace laughed softly and shook her head. "They are just ideas. They look like plans." She looked down at the pages again. Plans cost money. Caleb closed the notebook gently and handed it back. "Not always. Sometimes they just need the right moment." His words stayed with her long after he walked out into the rain. That evening, Grace carried the sketchbook home through crowded subway platforms, imagining for just a few minutes what life might feel like if she actually owned a tiny design studio instead of borrowing dreams between shifts. Reality returned as soon as she unlocked her apartment. The stack of medical invoices waiting on the kitchen counter had grown again. Her mother needed another round of physical therapy after her recent surgery, and the insurance coverage had already reached its limit. Grace quietly organized the bills into neat piles, telling herself that tomorrow would somehow be easier. It always had to be. Meanwhile, several blocks away inside the glass headquarters of Whitmore Holdings, Caleb sat through a 3-hour board meeting without hearing half of what was said. Financial forecasts appeared across enormous presentation screens while executives debated acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet his attention kept drifting toward a folded receipt tucked inside his leather notebook. Every time the discussion became exhausting, he glanced at the simple pencil sketch Grace had drawn during her shift. His chief financial officer finally noticed. "That piece of paper seems more interesting than our quarterly report." Caleb smiled without looking up. "It is." His assistant quietly informed him that another charity gala would take place in 3 weeks, bringing together investors, entrepreneurs, and nonprofit organizations from across New York. Caleb approved the invitation list almost absent-mindedly before pausing at one particular proposal. A young entrepreneur named Ryan Cole had requested a private introduction regarding a creative arts investment initiative. Caleb signed the approval without another thought. He had no way of knowing that the decision would soon place Ryan directly into Grace's life. At nearly the same time, Grace received an unexpected phone call from a neighborhood business association inviting local artists to meet potential sponsors during an upcoming networking dinner. She almost declined immediately. Fancy restaurants, expensive dresses, and wealthy investors belonged to another world. But when she looked again at the unpaid medical bills, and then at the little sketchbook resting on her coffee table, hope whispered louder than fear. She promised herself it was only one dinner, only one conversation, and certainly not the beginning of a story that would test every feeling she had quietly allowed herself to develop for the kind man who claimed he worked in investments. The invitation sat on Grace's tiny kitchen table for 2 full days before she finally opened it again. The thick cream-colored envelope looked completely out of place beside unpaid utility bills, grocery coupons, and a cracked ceramic coffee mug she refused to throw away because it had belonged to her mother. The words inside were simple enough. Local artists and creative entrepreneurs were invited to attend a private networking dinner hosted by the Manhattan Creative Business Alliance. Selected investors would be available to discuss funding opportunities for promising ideas. Grace almost laughed. She had never considered herself an entrepreneur. She was a waitress who happened to fill sketchbooks whenever life became too heavy. Yet every time she tried to throw the invitation away, she remembered Caleb's quiet voice saying that dreams did not always need money first. Sometimes they simply needed the right moment. On Thursday afternoon, Caleb arrived at the diner as usual, but something felt different immediately. Grace was distracted. She accidentally placed cream instead of milk beside his coffee, forgot another customer's pie order, and stared through the front window several times as though searching for answers hidden somewhere beyond the passing traffic. Caleb noticed before she said a single word. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. Grace forced a smile that fooled no one. "I received an invitation to a networking dinner." Caleb nodded with genuine interest. "That sounds exciting." "It sounds terrifying," she admitted with a nervous laugh. "Everyone there will probably have expensive business cards and fancy degrees. I have a sketchbook with coffee stains." Caleb smiled. "Sometimes that is exactly what people remember." She looked at him curiously. "You really believe that?" I believe people remember honesty long after they forget impressive introductions. Grace studied his expression for a moment. There was something comforting about the way he always answered without trying to impress anyone. It made every conversation feel unexpectedly easy. "Would you go?" she finally asked. Caleb paused just long enough to choose his words carefully. "If there is even a small chance that one evening could change the next 10 years of your life, I think it is worth buying a new pair of shoes." Grace laughed, glancing down at the worn sneakers beneath her apron. "You noticed?" "I noticed more than you think." Neither of them realized how true those words would become. Later that evening, after Caleb left, Grace stopped by a small thrift boutique on her walk home. She found a simple navy blue dress that fit almost perfectly and cost less than one day's tips. The sales clerk insisted the color matched her eyes. Grace was not completely convinced, but she bought it anyway. It felt less like purchasing a dress and more like purchasing permission to believe she belonged somewhere new. Across the city, Caleb stood inside his penthouse apartment overlooking the lights of Manhattan. His assistant had already prepared briefing folders for the same networking dinner Grace planned to attend. One folder contained financial summaries. Another listed every invited entrepreneur. Caleb barely looked through either one until a familiar name caught his attention near the bottom of the guest list. Grace Bennett, local artist. Independent invitation through community development program. His heartbeat slowed for reasons he could not explain. He had not known she would be attending. For a brief moment, he considered removing himself from the event altogether to avoid making her uncomfortable. Instead, he quietly closed the folder and placed the folded receipt with her pencil sketch beside it. Somewhere deep inside, hope began whispering that perhaps fate had arranged another unexpected meeting. Neither of them knew that someone else named Ryan Cole had already decided the same dinner would become the perfect opportunity to recruit a talented young designer for a project that sounded generous on the surface but concealed ambitions that would soon place all three of their lives on the same unforgettable path. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of golden sunset that made New York seem softer than usual. Grace stood in front of the narrow mirror inside her apartment, smoothing the simple navy blue dress one last time while trying to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. The fabric was elegant without trying too hard, and the small silver earrings her mother had given her years ago completed the look. Before leaving, she slipped her worn sketchbook into her canvas tote bag almost out of habit. It had followed her through every difficult season of life, and somehow carrying it tonight made her feel less alone. After taking a slow breath, she locked the apartment door and stepped into the evening believing she was only attending a networking dinner. She had no idea that every decision she made over the next few hours would quietly reshape her future. Across town, Caleb arrived through the private entrance of the Grand Lexington Hotel, where the event filled the rooftop ballroom overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Executives greeted him with practiced smiles, while photographers documented arrivals from a respectful distance. Caleb accepted polite handshakes, answered routine questions about market trends, and thanked the organizers before scanning the room almost instinctively. He told himself he was simply reviewing the guest list in person, yet his eyes searched for only one face. Grace entered through the main lobby several minutes later, feeling immediately out of place beneath sparkling chandeliers and polished marble floors. Conversations floated around her about venture capital, expansion strategies, and international partnerships. She quietly checked the name tag attached to her invitation and reminded herself that everyone had once attended their first event. Instead of hiding near the entrance, she walked toward the refreshment table and accepted a glass of sparkling water, determined not to let fear decide her evening. Within minutes, a friendly voice interrupted her thoughts. "You must be Grace Bennett." She turned to see a well-dressed man in his early 30s offering a warm smile. "I am Ryan Cole. I read the description of your design work in the event materials. I have been hoping we would meet." Grace blinked with surprise. "You already knew my name?" Ryan nodded. "Your invitation included samples from your community portfolio. Your hand-drawn wedding stationery caught my attention immediately. There is something authentic about your style that most designers lose after formal training." Grace felt her cheeks warm. Compliments still made her uncomfortable because they were so unfamiliar. Ryan continued the conversation naturally, asking about her artistic goals instead of her financial situation. He listened carefully while she described her dream of opening a small design studio that specialized in custom invitations, neighborhood branding, and local family businesses. For the first time that evening, she relaxed enough to laugh. From across the ballroom, Caleb noticed the change immediately. He watched Grace speaking with a man he recognized from the investment proposals he had approved earlier that week. Ryan appeared confident, attentive, and genuinely interested in everything Grace said. Caleb reminded himself that there was no reason to feel unsettled. Grace was free to meet anyone she wished. They had never defined whatever existed between them beyond shared conversations inside a neighborhood diner. Even so, an unfamiliar feeling settled quietly inside his chest as he watched Ryan pull out a chair for Grace before joining her at a small table overlooking the city lights. Neither Grace nor Ryan noticed Caleb observing from the opposite side of the ballroom. She believed she had simply met an encouraging investor. Ryan believed he had discovered an exceptionally talented young designer. Caleb believed he had more time to understand what Grace truly meant to him. Before the evening was over, each of those assumptions would begin to unravel in ways none of them could possibly foresee. Grace barely noticed how quickly the ballroom filled around them, because Ryan had an easy way of making every conversation feel personal instead of transactional. Unlike several investors she had already met that evening, he never interrupted her or glanced over her shoulder, searching for someone more important. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about her sketches, her favorite artists, and why so many of her designs featured handwritten details instead of computer-generated fonts. Grace smiled as she opened her sketchbook and carefully turned a few pages. There were watercolor storefront concepts inspired by neighborhoods across Manhattan, elegant wedding invitations decorated with wildflowers, and small coffee shop logos she had imagined during quiet afternoons at the diner. Ryan examined each page with genuine interest. "You are not selling artwork," he said. "You are creating memories people will keep for years." Grace lowered her eyes, almost embarrassed by the compliment. "Most people just see doodles." Ryan shook his head. "Most people do not know where to look." Several feet away, Caleb had been answering questions from board members and nonprofit directors while trying to remain focused on the event. Every few minutes his attention drifted back toward Grace's table without permission. He watched her laugh more freely than he had ever seen inside the diner. He noticed Ryan listening with complete attention, leaning forward whenever Grace explained another design. Caleb reminded himself that this was exactly why the networking dinner existed. Creative people met potential investors every day. Nothing unusual was happening. Yet the quiet certainty he had carried for weeks began giving way to something unfamiliar. He realized he knew almost everything about Grace's hopes, but almost nothing about the place he occupied in her life. Before he could think any further, the evening host stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone officially. Soft applause echoed through the ballroom as the presentation began. The speaker thanked community organizations, creative entrepreneurs, and corporate sponsors before inviting several investors to introduce themselves. Ryan's name was called first. He delivered a brief speech about supporting neighborhood businesses and encouraging artists whose work strengthened local communities. When he finished, polite applause filled the room. As Ryan returned to his seat beside Grace, he quietly asked, "Would you consider meeting again next week? I believe your studio deserves serious funding, and I would like to explore several possibilities with you." Grace hesitated only for a moment before answering honestly. "I would like that. Even if nothing comes from it. I appreciate someone believing in my work." Ryan smiled warmly. "Then let us call it our first official meeting." At that exact moment, Caleb happened to glance toward their table. From where he stood, he saw Ryan extending his hand across the table while Grace accepted it with an appreciative smile. The scene lasted only a few seconds, yet without hearing the conversation, it appeared far more intimate than it truly was. Caleb felt an unexpected weight settle in his chest. It surprised him how deeply such a simple gesture affected him. His assistant approached quietly. "Mr. Whitmore, the organizers are ready to introduce our keynote guest." Caleb nodded automatically, though his attention never completely left Grace. Meanwhile, Grace remained completely unaware that the quiet customer from the neighborhood diner was somewhere inside the same ballroom. She believed he was probably finishing another ordinary workday in an office across the city. She had no reason to imagine that the man who always claimed he simply worked in investments was about to walk onto the stage before hundreds of guests, and that within the next few minutes. Every assumption she had ever made about him would change forever. The applause slowly faded as the master of ceremonies smiled toward the audience once again. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce the visionary whose foundation made tonight's event possible. Please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Whitmore Holdings, Mr. Caleb Whitmore. Grace felt the world stop. The name echoed through the ballroom, while every guest rose to their feet in a standing ovation. She stared toward the stage in complete disbelief as Caleb walked into the spotlight with the same calm expression she had seen across countless cups of coffee at the neighborhood diner. The quiet man who claimed he simply worked in investments was suddenly surrounded by admiration, cameras, and executives eager to shake his hand. Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of her sketchbook. Her heart pounded so loudly she barely heard the beginning of Caleb's speech. Every conversation they had shared replayed inside her mind. Every simple answer, every modest smile, every moment she had believed she knew exactly who he was. Ryan noticed the change in her expression immediately. "Grace, are you all right?" She looked toward him without truly seeing him. "You know him?" Ryan smiled politely. "Everyone in this room knows Caleb Whitmore. He built one of the largest investment firms in the country before turning 40. Half the organizations represented here exist because of his support." Grace slowly looked back at the stage. Caleb spoke about creating opportunities for talented people who simply needed someone willing to believe in them. His words sounded exactly like the conversations they had shared inside the diner. Nothing about his personality had changed. Only the truth behind it had. When the speech ended, the audience applauded once more. Caleb accepted the applause graciously before stepping away from the podium. For a brief second, his eyes found Grace across the crowded ballroom. Their gaze locked in complete silence. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them looked away. Grace stood almost automatically, needing fresh air more than answers. She quietly excused herself from Ryan and walked toward the rooftop terrace overlooking the glowing skyline. The cool evening breeze brushed against her face as she struggled to understand why the discovery hurt more than it should have. She was not upset because Caleb was wealthy. She was hurt because he had trusted her with conversations about dreams, fears, and ordinary life, while hiding the single fact that defined how the entire world saw him. A few moments later, footsteps approached behind her. Caleb stopped several feet away, giving her space. "Grace." She turned slowly. "You are Caleb Whitmore." He nodded once. "Yes." She searched his face for the familiar customer from the diner and found him still standing there beneath the expensive suit. "How long were you planning to keep pretending?" she asked quietly. Caleb answered without hesitation. "I never wanted to pretend. I only wanted one person to know me before knowing everything that comes with my name." Grace looked down at the sketchbook she still held against her chest. "You could have trusted me with the truth." Caleb took one careful step closer. "I was afraid the truth would change the way you looked at me." Grace lifted her eyes again, filled not with anger but disappointment. "Caleb, you never gave me the chance to prove that it would not." Before he could answer, laughter drifted from inside the ballroom as Ryan stepped onto the terrace carrying 2 untouched glasses of sparkling water. Seeing Caleb and Grace standing together, he paused politely, unaware that the quiet evening had just become far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Ryan sensed the tension the moment he stepped onto the terrace. He looked from Grace to Caleb with polite curiosity before offering each of them a glass of sparkling water. "I hope I am not interrupting," he said with an easy smile. Grace accepted the glass almost automatically, grateful for the brief pause. Caleb declined with a quiet shake of his head, never taking his eyes off Grace. Ryan finally recognized him completely and extended his hand respectfully. "Mr. Whitmore, it is an honor to finally meet you in person. Thank you for approving my proposal to attend tonight." Caleb returned the handshake with professional courtesy. "I remember your application. Your presentation was well prepared." Ryan smiled. "I appreciate that. Actually, Grace and I were discussing the possibility of working together. I believe her designs deserve a much larger audience." Grace looked surprised. Ryan's words were sincere, spoken without arrogance or hidden pressure. Before she could respond, another group of guests stepped onto the terrace, greeting Caleb enthusiastically. Someone congratulated him on another successful year of charitable investments while another executive asked for a photograph. Caleb answered politely, but every interruption widened the invisible distance between him and Grace. She quietly watched strangers speak about private jets, acquisitions, and international conferences with effortless familiarity. It was a world she had never imagined, yet everyone around Caleb moved through it as naturally as breathing. She suddenly understood why he had hidden his identity. She also understood why discovering the truth felt so overwhelming. When the crowd finally drifted away, Ryan checked his watch. "Grace, would you still like to continue our conversation over dinner next Wednesday? There is a small Italian restaurant in Soho where we could discuss your studio ideas without all of this noise." Grace hesitated. She looked briefly toward Caleb, searching for some explanation that still had not come. Instead, she answered honestly, "Yes, I think that would be nice." Ryan smiled warmly. "Perfect. I will send you the details tomorrow." He excused himself to greet another guest, leaving Grace and Caleb alone once again beneath the city lights. Silence stretched between them. Caleb spoke first. "Is that why you came tonight?" Grace looked at him with quiet confusion. "To meet someone else?" She frowned gently. "I came because I received an invitation to present my work." Meeting Ryan was unexpected. Caleb lowered his voice. "Do you trust him?" Grace folded her arms, not defensively but thoughtfully. "I barely know him." After a brief pause, she added, "The same way I realized tonight that I barely knew you." The words landed with painful honesty. Caleb looked toward the skyline before answering. "You knew the part of me that mattered most." Grace shook her head slowly. "No, Caleb. I knew the version you decided was safe for me to see. There is a difference." She reached into her canvas tote and gently removed the folded receipt with the little pencil sketch she had given him weeks earlier. She smiled sadly when she noticed he had carefully preserved it without a single crease. "You carried this with you?" Caleb nodded. "Every day." Grace's eyes softened for just a moment. "Then why did you not trust the person who drew it?" Caleb searched for an answer that would make sense, but none came. Fear had seemed reasonable before tonight. Standing in front of Grace now, it felt painfully small. She slipped the sketch back into his hand and closed his fingers around it. "I need time," she whispered. "Not because you are a billionaire, but because I do not know where the truth ends and the performance begins." Without another word, Grace turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving Caleb standing alone beneath the glowing Manhattan skyline with the little drawing that had once filled him with hope and now reminded him that even the greatest fortunes could not repair trust in a single evening. Grace did not answer Caleb's messages during the following week. There were only 3 of them, each shorter than the last, and none attempted to justify what had happened. The first simply asked if she had arrived home safely. The second wished her mother a successful therapy appointment after remembering the date from one of their conversations at the diner. The third contained only 7 words. "I should have trusted you from the beginning." Grace read every message more than once, but never replied. She needed silence more than explanations. Life quickly returned to its familiar rhythm. Morning subway rides, long shifts carrying coffee pots between crowded tables, and evenings spent helping her mother organize medical paperwork filled most of her days. Whenever she felt overwhelmed, she opened her sketchbook and drew another storefront, another invitation, another dream that still seemed impossibly far away. Caleb never returned to the diner. His usual booth beside the window remained empty every Tuesday and Thursday, and Grace noticed it every single time she walked past with a tray in her hands. She told herself it should not matter, yet the absence somehow felt louder than his quiet conversations had ever been. Wednesday evening finally arrived, and Grace kept her promise to meet Ryan at the little Italian restaurant in Soho. The place was warm, welcoming, and refreshingly ordinary. Red brick walls, soft jazz playing through hidden speakers, and handwritten menus created exactly the kind of atmosphere Grace loved. Ryan was already waiting when she arrived. Instead of business contracts or polished presentations, he greeted her with a folder containing printed photographs of her designs from the networking event. "I wanted to show you something," he said as she took her seat. Grace opened the folder carefully. Each sketch had been professionally scanned and displayed beside market research showing how personalized design businesses had grown throughout the country. Ryan explained every page patiently, never rushing her. "You have a style that large companies cannot manufacture," he said. People want authenticity now. They want something that feels created by a real person instead of software. Grace listened with growing excitement. For the first time, someone was discussing her work as a real business instead of a pleasant hobby. Then Ryan reached into his briefcase and placed another document on the table. "This is not a contract," he explained immediately. "It is simply a proposal. I would like to invest in your studio if you ever decide to open one. You would own the company. You would make every creative decision. I would only provide funding and business guidance." Grace stared at the document without touching it. "Why would you do that for someone you barely know?" Ryan smiled thoughtfully. "Because I have spent years investing in companies. Very rarely do I find someone worth investing in first." His answer was calm and sincere. At that exact moment, the restaurant television mounted above the bar switched to a local business news segment. Neither of them had been paying attention until the anchor announced Whitmore Holdings' newest community initiative. Caleb appeared on the screen, standing inside an empty downtown building that would soon become a creative incubator for neighborhood artists and small business owners. During the interview, the reporter asked why he had chosen to invest in independent creators instead of another large corporation. Caleb paused before answering. "Because sometimes the greatest talent is already working hard. It simply has not been seen yet." Grace quietly lowered her eyes. She recognized those words immediately. They echoed the conversation they had shared inside the diner on a rainy afternoon, and for the first time since the gala, she began wondering whether Caleb had been trying to prove his feelings through actions instead of explanations all along. The following Saturday morning, Grace received a plain white envelope with no company logo and no return address. Inside was a handwritten note and a single invitation. The note contained only one sentence. "No speeches, no cameras, and no expectations. I only hope you will see what I should have shown you from the beginning." Curiosity quietly replaced hesitation. That afternoon, she followed the address to an old brick warehouse on the west side of Manhattan, expecting another business presentation. Instead, she found sunlight pouring through enormous factory windows onto polished wooden floors transformed into a warm creative space filled with easels, drafting tables, handmade paper samples, watercolor sets, and shelves lined with art supplies. Young artists worked quietly in different corners of the building, smiling as they welcomed her inside. A small plaque near the entrance caught her attention. It read, "The Community Studio, a place where talent meets opportunity." Grace slowly walked farther into the room until she noticed one familiar object displayed beneath a simple glass frame. It was the faded diner receipt where she had sketched Caleb's portrait weeks earlier. Beneath it was another small card. "The day someone saw the person before the title." Her eyes filled with quiet emotion. Caleb stepped forward from the far side of the studio wearing the same simple navy jacket he had worn the afternoon they first met. There were no executives beside him, no photographers, and no security surrounding him. He looked less like a billionaire and more like the man who had once smiled over a cup of coffee while listening to a waitress talk about impossible dreams. He stopped several feet away and spoke gently. "This building does not belong to me. It belongs to the community. Artists can use it without paying rent during their first year. Small businesses can receive mentoring without giving away ownership. No one will ever be asked to trade their dream for someone else's control." Grace looked around the room once more before returning her attention to him. "You built all of this." Caleb shook his head. "I only paid for the walls. People like you will give it purpose." He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully removed her worn sketchbook. "You left this on the terrace that night." Grace accepted it with both hands, surprised to discover several blank pages had been filled with neatly printed notes. They were not drawings. They were names of local printers, suppliers, neighborhood galleries, grant programs, and community organizations willing to support independent designers. Caleb smiled softly. "I promised myself I would never solve your future by writing a check. I wanted to open doors, not decide which one you should walk through." Grace closed the sketchbook slowly. For the first time since the gala, she understood the difference between being rescued and being respected. Ryan's investment proposal had offered her a business. Caleb's actions had protected her freedom to build one on her own terms. Just then Ryan entered the studio carrying a box of printing samples and laughed when he saw both of them standing together. "Looks like I arrived at exactly the right moment," he said warmly. He walked over to Grace and extended his proposal folder. "I heard about this place yesterday. If you still want an investor someday, my offer remains exactly the same. No pressure, no deadlines, and no hard feelings if you choose another path. Grace smiled gratefully before shaking his hand. Thank you for believing in my work. Ryan nodded toward Caleb with genuine respect. I think both of us saw the same thing from the beginning. After Ryan left, silence settled comfortably between Grace and Caleb. She finally looked up at him with the same gentle expression she had worn inside the diner weeks before. You were right about one thing, she said quietly. People do remember honesty. Caleb smiled. I learned that from a waitress who carried a sketchbook everywhere she went. Grace laughed softly before taking one careful step closer. Then let us start over. No secrets this time. Caleb nodded without hesitation. No secrets. As afternoon sunlight filled the studio, artists continued sketching, painting, and dreaming around them, completely unaware that the greatest masterpiece created inside those old brick walls was not hanging in a frame. It was the quiet beginning of a relationship built not on wealth or status, but on trust finally earned, kindness returned, and two ordinary hearts choosing honesty before everything else.